when you write a phonological rule, there's two ways to do it. You can write a phonological rule in a sentence, but there's also this formal notation. And some people like to learn this, and some people would prefer to just keep using the sentences they want. And in Introduction to Linguistics, I don't care either way. And in fact, if you take a look at my dissertation, you'll see every rule I wrote for Betsmasaraka Malagasy is written in this formal notation and also a sentence. So both of those have professional status. It's just what makes more sense to you. So in our book, we see the rule format explained this way, that X becomes Y in the environment after C and before D. So X, that's your phoneme. So phonemes are going to change their pronunciation based on environment, right? So we need to say which phoneme we're talking about. And when we first start doing rules, we're just going to write the IPA symbol, but it's going to be in slashes to say that's a phoneme. And later we'll be able to generalize more. And if you decide to continue with phonology, this will be a continuing quest of making the most general rules possible that accurately describe a language. So the arrow tells you what it says, okay, this is what it's becoming, and then you'll write the allophone. And again, at first, that'll be an IPA symbol, but not in slashes. It's going to be in brackets to say this is a pronunciation, this is a phonetic realization, as we say in the jargon of linguistics. That slash says, okay, we're done talking about the allophones and phonemes. Now we're going to tell you what the environment is. And just to keep the slashes separate, I'll try to make this a bigger, bolder slash. And then you have this environment. And so it can be what it comes after, or it can be what comes before, or it can be what surrounds it. So if it comes after an E, you'd write an E where it says C there. If it happens before a voiced sound, you'd write that where the D is. And then, we'll talk about some things have to be surrounded, and then you'll need both spots. So looking at some of the rules, some of the alternations we've talked about in this same format. So you can see we said that T, the phoneme T, is pronounced as a glottal stop in this unusual environment, unstressed vowels before an N. We talked about why we can't just say before syllabic N, although that would be a little easier to say. It's not true. It does it not just before N, so we can say button, but we can also say button with an I, and we can say button with a schwa. So we can't just say that one thing. So our environment gets a little crazier. So here's our phoneme. That's the T in slashes. Our allophone is the glottal stop. So it's remaining a voiceless stop, but it is becoming glottal instead of alveolar. And then this underscore here says this is where the change is going to happen. So when it is in this space, it's going to happen. Before a vowel that is minus stress. So this subscript here is talking about describing that vowel. And then after that comes an N. So it's a sequence of two things. Element 1 is the stressless vowel. Element 2 is that N. And it has to be an N, right? It can't be an M or an enma. Another realization of the T phoneme is it becomes a flap or a tap before any other unstressed vowel. So remember, the symbol looks like an R, but the actual R symbol, that's like we hear in Spanish. And for the real R that we always write in English, we can do the upside down R, which is not involved in this at all. So we have this special symbol. That's that thing that maybe sounds a little bit like a D, but as we showed in class, the tongue position is different. So T is pronounced as a flap in the following environment before a stressless vowel. And fortunately, because we have rule ordering, we can have this one first and this one second. So we won't get cases. So the word button we have to say like this, right? And I'm going to write it with the syllabic nasal. That's button. What we don't get is this button. because this rule has to apply first. So yeah, maybe instead of bullets, I should have real numbers here, 1 and 2. And then it is the way this phoneme is pronounced at the beginning of words and stressed syllables is we have these representations here. So the phoneme T is pronounced as its allophone aspirated T in this environment. And so this hashtag, this pound sign, whatever you want to call it, says this is a word boundary. And if it follows the word boundary, which is another way of saying at the beginning of the word, then it's pronounced this way, which is why words, not just words like time, have the aspiration, but words like, I can't think of one right now. We would need a verb, right? I'll come up with one maybe as I keep talking. And of course, at the we talked about words like until, where even if it's in the middle of the word, it gets aspirated if the vowel is stressed. So until, that's an unstressed syllable, so we can use a schwa there. And until will be pronounced this way. So no one says unil or undil because we have a stressed syllable there. And it's T elsewhere. There are actually a couple other slightly more subtle allophonic relationships, but this is totally fine for this class to know about just these 4. And so we call the phoneme T, right? We don't call it aspirated T, we don't call it glottal stop, we don't call it flap. So the elsewhere condition, this rule of phonology just comes through and fixes everything for us. So it turns everything that's left into just a regular unaspirated T. And that's not to say that some languages don't have phonemic glottal stop, right? So if you look at Hawaiian or Arabic, they'll write their glottal stop in slashes because that's a phoneme of the language. And of course, if you look at Spanish or other languages where the R is pronounced this way, like Japanese, that's a phoneme of the language. But in English, we don't have a phoneme for those. We only have an allophone of T. So we have this nice rule here with IPA symbols, and this is true, but there's a little problem with it, and that's that IPA symbols, if you come from a reading first way of thinking about language, you might think an IPA symbol is the basic unit of language, the way a letter is the basic unit of writing, right? So a letter is the lowest we can get. There's nothing, we don't have in English any connection, anything less than a letter, right? So we have things like P and Q and B and D, and it looks like maybe there's something going on with those letters where like maybe rotating has something to do with it, but no. The letter is totally basic, you just have to memorize it. But IPA symbols are not the bottom level. Remember, I said you can say an IPA symbol, but you can also always say the full featural description. So that's what an IPA symbol is. So when you say T, you're at least saying plus stop, plus alveolar, minus voice. Minus voice is a way to say voiceless, right? And when you say glottal stop, you're saying plus stop, plus glottal. Maybe you could say minus voice, although we talked about how we can't do voicing at the glottis, so maybe we don't have to say that. When you say vowel minus stress, that's just another way of saying vowel minus, plus vowel minus stress. And when we say N, that's a way of saying plus nasal, plus alveolar. We don't need to say voiced because all nasals are voiced. We don't need to say stop because all nasals in English are stops. And so we can write our rule this way, or we can write this sentence. So both of these are good. Voiceless alveolar stops become glottal stops before an unstressed vowel, then an alveolar nasal. Again, that's kind of a lot for the babies, right? The babies have to memorize this really long rule. And if you think about it, we're saying stops become stops. That's a weird thing to say, that stops become stops. Stops are already stops. So we can make a more parsimonious version, and that will make it easier on the babies. When the babies have to learn a whole language in 5 years, they don't have to memorize something silly like stops become stops. So first thing we do is we get rid of that extra stop, right? So now we don't need to say that a stop becomes a stop. So now look, our rule is better. Voiceless alveolar stops become glottal. They don't become glottal stops. They're already stops. They just become glottal before an unstressed vowel and then an alveolar nasal. Let me clear this up here. There's another kind of change we can do. So remember, the D also flaps, right? So Adam are pronounced the same. They both have a flap in them. So T and D, they're pronounced with a flap before other unstressed vowels. So we can write that this way. And we're working with two phonemes here. This is called neutralization. This distinction is being lost when you have a T or a D in that case. But remember, IPA symbols are just a handy writing mechanism. They aren't a real thing phonologically. So we have to say plus stop plus alveolar becomes plus flap plus alveolar, or in a sentence format, alveolar stops become alveolar flaps before an unstressed vowel. I hope you can see, even before I tell you, the redundancy here that's similar to last time. So one thing we didn't do is we didn't say voiced and voiceless stops, because that's not parsimonious. We just need to describe the natural class. So if we say plus voice and minus voice, that's all the voicing possibilities. So clearly, voicing has nothing to do with it. It affects voiced and voiceless, so it affects everything. Voicing is not a factor. But we're still saying alveolar becomes alveolar, just like last time we had that problem. And alveolars don't become alveolars. Alveolars are always alveolars. So if we take out the IPA symbols, then we can make, again, a more parsimonious version of the rule for the babies. So we take out that second alveolar. And now our rule says alveolar stops become flaps before an unstressed vowel. Much more parsimonious here. We're focusing only on what changes. And the only thing that changes is that it becomes a flap. Now, if you want to say plus flap plus voice, I guess I would understand that. But flaps are approximants, and approximants are always voiced, so we don't need to say that. So now we've looked a lot at English, and there's some advantages to looking at English. So you can witness the phonology occurring in your own grammar, especially with pairs like Adam and Adam, where you can hear that distinction being lost. It's not like in mountain, where maybe you never noticed there wasn't a T there. And then, of course, a lot of you in this class are going to be teachers, and this can help you with your students' pronunciation. You won't tell students that, oh yeah, the T in button gets swallowed, or it's silent, or something like that. You can tell them, oh yeah, that is very similar to a T, but it's made down here in your throat. And then they won't, and you won't, of course, you won't criticize students who say button and say they're mispronouncing it or they're being lazy or anything, because you'll understand the scientific explanation behind it. But when people study phonology, they actually often don't look at their own language. Like I said, English speakers might have trouble hearing the difference between the T in stop and the T in top and the T in mountain. They might only know that that is a T either because of writing or because of the phonemic relationship. So if you study foreign phonologies, you can hear the difference. Like if you look at, what did we look at last time? Oh, we looked at S and Z in Spanish, right? So S and Z in Spanish are allophones of the same phoneme. So it's really easy for English speakers to hear that difference. Whereas for Spanish speakers, and if you're a Spanish speaker, you probably had this feeling doing the assignment. You're like, wait a minute, this is the same letter or the same sound. And yes, it is the same sound. It's in the sense that it's the same phoneme. And also phonology can help you with your foreign pronunciation. If you just think about foreign pronunciation as these systematic rules, it can help you with that. So if you're going to continue with this by looking at Korean. So in Korean, we're going to look at s and sh. These two sounds that, of course, in English are allophones of distinct phonemes. They're different sounds to an English speaker. So all you need is a minimal pair, either an easy one like see and she, or maybe a more subtle one like Dixon and diction. But in both of those cases, you can sub out a s for a sh, and the pronunciation totally changes. So what you're going to do for your 4th hour assignment is look at this list of Korean words and make some environments, make a list of the environments and see which one is the phoneme and what is the phonemic, the allophonic relationship between the two of them. And so that'll be your 4th hour, and we'll go over that in class next time.